to come live. Just waiting for it to start, and then I'm going to share. Okay, we're starting. Okay, so I'm to share screen, and we're going to. All right, so last week we were actually talking about it. We were talking about quantitative research, and I'm going to go back to this at the end of the class today. But in the meantime, I'm going to go to qualitative and go back to quantitative research and then continue next week. So for those who are anxious, I'm going to go back to the beginning of quantitative at the end, the tail end of this lecture. So with that in mind, here we are. We're going to talk briefly today about collecting qualitative data. So everybody already knows that qualitative data are the data. Wait, why is this doing this to me? Okay, all right. Qualitative, I have to be letting people into the class, even as I'm lecturing class, you will come in. So you all know that qualitative data are non-numeric data that people collect for a research project. And in a qualitative project, if it's about people, because usually in the context of computing, we're talking about non-numeric data from people. So you would need to have the participants and the place where you're doing it, I guess, which could include a virtual set. So this set normally means a particular setting. Hi, unless you have a specific question, please mute your mic. Thank you. You would need to not only identify the participants and where you're going to do the project, you need to make sure you actually have access to the people and the sites where you're going to do it. So if you're going to go to a prison, obviously you can't just walk in. But if you're going to go to a school, similarly, you can't just walk in and start interviewing children because you need the permission of their parents and the school and the rest of it. Also, I got to message. There is. Sorry about that, guys. I have somebody calling themselves. Let me see what the name is. Queen Thug Life. Sorry, guys. A real name, you're not going to get let in. Like seriously, I don't know what joke life you are living. Back to where we are. So you need to identify what kind of information you're going to need to answer the research questions. Remember, one research question that is powerful is good enough for a research project. You need to figure out what is all the data you're going to need. You need to figure out what are the steps and the instruments. By instruments, we need interviews, etc. Focus groups, whatever you're going to do to collect that data. It could be observations, and if it's an observation as you see in the presentation today, you actually need to figure out exactly how you're going to do it to have a system so that you actually collect and record. And if you're more than one person doing that particular qualitative data collection, everybody doing it in the same, using the same approach. All right, so you're going to administer the data collection, and there are different approaches. So one way is called purposive sampling, where you can either do it randomly or purposefully. So if it's randomly, then you're going to be able to make claims about the population. Not usually, you don't talk about random sampling for qualitative, because typically qualitative sampling usually is one of the non-quantitative. Remember last week we just started briefly talking about probability sampling and non-probability sampling, and we said last week that probability sampling, if it's done properly, by the way, will be representative of the population. But usually in qualitative projects, it tends to be purposive, as in some kind of non-probability sampling for lots of reasons. But in quantitative world, you actually want, if possible, to do a statistical approach, probability sampling, so that you can generalize from the sample to the population. And so then if you do that properly, you can make claims like most of the population believes this, or you can say there's a association between X and variable A and variable B and ray, rah, rah. And that's, however, in quantitative data collection, typically it is understanding a phenomenon so that you can have understanding, so you can gain useful information, have people learn about a phenomenon, and perhaps in some cases give voice to people who are not able to make their voices known. I think computing, I'm not sure who that is typically, because that tends to be more in the social and humanities, social sciences and humanities. So perhaps, you know, like maybe, and this won't even silence people, there's been some thought in the past about the relatively low levels of women in computer science education. And I don't know if they're silenced, but why is it that women tend and females tend to go less? There can be studies like essentially like interviewing females in high schools, females in universities. I think we in Jamaica actually have a relatively high percentage of females compared to other parts of the world. Sorry, I don't know the data exactly, but insofar as there is limited amount, there could be some research on that. That could be an example of that. So what are the ways in which you could do qualitative sampling? There's a whole lot of kind of things you want to do. So you want to think about, before you collect the data, what is your intent as the researcher? Is it to develop many perspectives? Is it to describe a subgroup in depth? Is it to describe what is typical? Is it to describe what happens in a dramatic situation? The point is there are all these different possibilities, and depending on the possibility, you want to do different kinds of sampling. So if you want one subgroup, so like I just said, female computer science students, I could say female computer science students in Kingston, Jamaica. Perhaps those would be homogeneous. In fact, maybe if I even go further than that, and I say like female computer science students who grew up in urban areas, who live in urban areas, but that might be even different than the people who come from country, you know, from rural parts of Jamaica. I don't know, but that is homogeneous, as opposed to, instead of that, I could have decided that I wanted to look at perspective of all university students in computer science. And if I did that, I could then compare the males and the females to kind of figure out what's the difference, as opposed to that's a maximal variation. Maybe what I really want to know is about female computer science, but I decided to go broad and compare the males and the females so I can see how females are different than males. The point is there are many different approaches, and you just read through these based on the goal. Now, does anybody remember, in general, there is many differences between qualitative and quantitative, and one of them is that in general, when you decide to do primarily qualitative data, is it that people who are experts, do they tend to know a lot about that area, or is it that they know not much about that area in general? Anybody who is here in the class? Repeat my question. Somebody who is smart about research and is making a good decision, and they have decided to do a qualitative only research project. Is it typically that experts know a lot about that area, or is it typically that experts don't know much about that area for qualitative project? Nobody in the class? Wow. Well, typically, by the way, you guys are there? No, something in the chat, so I would say, I would say they know. I don't know what they know what. Not sure what that, I'm not sure what that means, but typically in quantitative research, there usually is already some amount of things written about that area. generally with qualitative, there is less already written. So qualitative tends to be, qualitative, which is what we're looking at today, tends to be where there is exploration of something that is not much is known about it, generally. So generally the intent when you're doing qualitative is to discover what is not known, that not much is known about an area. In general, when you're, so the thing about it, because not generally not much is known, um, after data collection has started, is the intention of the researcher or research team to take advantage of whatever unfolds. And so, by the way, we have talked about research questions. In qualitative research, there's a possibility that research question could change. In quantitative research, the research question doesn't change after data collection starts. But basically, the frame of the research is already determined carefully by the literature review. Because in general, there's, depending on the nature of the qualitative, not much is known. You may decide to, oh, there is some data coming up that is unexpected. And so you say, okay, well, we need to like change the plan. So that's called opportunistic sampling. However, it could be that we actually have sort of like, can't call it a hypothesis, but we have a suspicion, an educated guess as to what is going to happen. And so we decide to do confirming, disconfirming sampling, depending on what is happening with the data collection. Or maybe it is that we're just trying to find enough data that meets what we're trying to find out. And so sometimes it's just difficult to locate the people who match the criteria. And so snowball sampling is where you ask people who meet the criteria for your research. Do they know anybody else? And that snowballs. So depending on your intention before or after, there are different approaches to what is called purposeful sampling. So we're going to go back today and next week about sample size for quantitative projects. I think I mentioned it at the end of class last week, but with the sample size, does anybody have any idea how, it says it right on the screen, so it says small. Why are we looking for small sizes for qualitative? Anybody has any idea? As opposed to just as a in comparison, quantitative projects are looking for relatively large sizes. So we had rules of thumb on the other slideshow, which is like for experiential study at least 30, meaning at least 15 for the experiential group and 15 for the control group. For observation studies, at least 30. For surveys, generally at least 100. Those are the kinds of rules of thumb. But typically you're expecting usually more than 100. But in some projects it could be maybe as low as 30 for quantitative. In some qualitative projects it's actually less than that. So can anybody say why is it quote unquote okay to have small samples for qualitative? Nobody's reading ahead or even willing to guess. Basically,
like, I can guess.
Go ahead.
I'm guessing the aim of a quantitative to get quantitative data is usually using statistics to analyze the data afterwards. So a larger sample size would probably be better to get a holistic like a better view or based on the answers. Whereas qualitative.
In fact, let me just pause it there. Even based on statistics theory, if you don't have sufficient numbers, you won't be able to make those statistical generalizations.
Right.
So you won't be able to based on statistics theory. Right. So let's hear your contrast now.
So, and then qualitative would be more, I'm thinking of qualitative data gathering as it'd be more like an interview or focus groups or something like that, where you're getting more in-depth data from any one person. Right. So you don't necessarily need a lot of people. And then to process a lot of that amount of data for a lot of people would be a lot of work anyway. But the fact that you're collecting out the scope of the data you're collecting from any one person is so large, you don't necessarily need a lot. of as a large sample size. That's my guess.
Yeah, and you're basically along the right track. So it's a number of things. So what you do is you collect what is called rich data. So whether it's an observation or an interview or a focus group, which are probably the three most common types of qualitative data about people, it takes a lot of time and money to collect that. And then you can actually look for patterns in that data that can tell you a lot. So it's a really a the research questions that are being asked is really very different than what you're asking in a quantitative project. So as it just says here about depends on purpose and context, it's just very vague. It really depends. It depends on what you're hoping to get to the project. And then there's this interesting concept called you're doing it until what is called saturation. So even though there tends to be a rule of thumb as to how many a sample size that you are looking for as a research team or researcher, once you find a pattern, so usually for qualitative studies, people are maybe looking for as much as 30 um, items being collected, but it can be that let's say you're doing interviews, and if all 20 interviews or maybe 18 or so 20 are saying almost the same thing, I don't even know exactly because I'm not a qualitative researcher. It's called saturation. So basically, once you find that almost everybody's saying almost the same thing, you don't necessarily have to go all the way of having the sample size that was expected because you already see a pattern, even including the exceptions. So just like all projects, qualitative needs permission from the Research Ethics Committee or the Institutional Review Board, and you need to permission from the people in charge of the research site. I don't mean the research itself. So if we're going into a school, we need the permission of the school principal slash school board slash administrator, somebody. And then if you go into a particular classroom, you also need to ask the teacher as well. So there usually is, after they get the researchers get permission from the, in Jamaica we call it Research Ethics Committee, and in the US we call it Institutional Review Board, then you still need to have a letter or a conversation with the gatekeepers, the people in charge at the place where the research is being done. You go into an organization, you need a letter. In fact, on that note, this is even not just for research. I just got a story just less than 2 weeks ago, I think it's even less than a week ago, about a student at UTech who presented a project with some sensitive data from the company. And when the teacher called the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, they say, oh, this is a student, one of the, you know, so somebody's presenting on this topic, and thanks, the teacher said, thanks for sponsoring the project. And the person stayed and listened to the presentation. And the long and the short of the whole story is that person was given a was asked to come to a hearing at the place that they work because basically disclose sensitive information about security matters without gaining permission. So whether it is research or school assignments, you need permission. I don't know what that person was doing, thinking that they could just do it without permission. So yeah, so you need permission. Right. So the differences between qualitative and quantitative permissions is that in a qualitative study, it's normally done at the research site because it's going to be a lot of personal contact, and they're personable, you know, not centered on variables and measures, and they have sometimes video cameras or audio recorders. That's a little bit different than something like survey instrument or measurement of precise. And so qualitative permissions are much more challenging to get. And so people tend to need to know what is this all about, you know, even more so than something else. So in that context, the gatekeeper need to know why you want to do this research, why you're choosing their site in particular, what time and resources are they're going to need to give up to you, what you're going to accomplish, is there any possibility of you being disruptive, what will the people who are involved in research actually gain from the study, if anything at all, and how you use and report the results. This one, sorry, apart from all the thing about whether it's going to actually be some sacrifice to the place, how you will use and report results is also very important. And by the way, you should be willing to give a report to the participants and the gatekeeper as in a summary that doesn't disclose the privacy of the people involved in the project. Because if the gatekeeper is not happy with how you're going to use the result, you either need to change how you're going to use the results, or they're not going to allow it to the project. And of course, you're not going to use it in a way that you've said that you're not going to use it. So you can be collecting observation, interviews, documents, obviously with permission, AV materials, anything that it is. And by interviews, we mean both one-on-one interviews and focus group interviews. So everybody, I think, knows what I mean by one-on-one. A focus group interview is a group of people being interviewed at the same time, basically. So we're going to talk about each of these things right now in the rest of the lecture, and then I'm going to rush over, if I have time, to speak a little bit about sampling for quantitative, and then continue with quantitative next week. Right, so observation. So we all know observations is gathering information by looking at what's happening at the research site. There are two ways to do it. Either you can hide yourself, that's what's called a non-participant observer, that you take notes, like, but nobody knows that you're taking the notes apart from you would have gotten permission from the gatekeeper. So there's an ethics committee at either at a university or at a government agencies giving research ethics approval, and then you would have gotten somebody who's in charge at the place to say, yes, go ahead with research. But if you're doing non-participant observation, the people don't know that you're hiding and doing the research. But there's also participant observation where people know that researchers are there. You can actually change back and forth, but once you're, hello, can you mute yourself, please? Once you are a participant observer, it may be difficult to go back to being a non-participant observer. So you can go from being a non-participant to a participant. So there are pros and cons of each of these. So generally, clearly, you need to get permissions to observe. And you should always do it in a way that is like non-obtrusive, even if you're a participant observer. And the idea is to observe without disrupting what's happening at the place when you were not there. So you're going to contact, usually it's one or multiple persons conducting observations over time, so you can actually understand what's happening at the place. And you're going to record notes. This and that's going to include what events, activities, and people, and then reflect on what is happening. All this is going to depend on what's the purpose of the project. So interviews. Interviews can be one-on-one or a group project, which is like a focus group. So one-on-one, phone, email, I would say all of these are one-on-one. And then we have a group interview, which is called a focus group. So they're usually open-ended, but really there are three types of interviews: structured, semi-structured, and unstructured, which we'll talk about in a second. But all of them are open-ended, even if they're structured. So you tend to create options for responding so people can voice their perspectives. In the best case scenario, you're going to ask permission to record it and then transcribe it, which actually means that if you're doing, you're not doing any data collection for this class, if you're doing this for your major project, it is actually best to get permission and record the interview and then transcribe it. Or you can transcribe with software programs. You don't necessarily have to play it back and type it out word for word yourself. There are good programs that do that. So for interviews, you need to identify the people who are appropriate, decide obviously in advance what type of interview you're going to be doing. Usually at a minimum, you have one person doing the interview questions and another person taking brief notes, because one person can't do both things. I mean, sometimes you could even have a third person who is actually observing the facial expressions of people and helping out the interview, but basically it's minimum two. And it should be some place that is quite suitable, as in suitable includes everything, like not too hot and not too, windy so you can't hear, something that's appropriate, that people are not interrupting what's happening with the interview. And obviously the people who are in the interview needs to give consent. Consent means that they agree to participate. So during the interview, you should have a plan, and usually that plan should be flexible. You should decide to have probes, where if people don't answer like fully, you say, and you said this, could you explain, as well as prompts to have them continue answer questions that they didn't really answer fully. So probe is like they said something, you want them to say more what they said, and a prompt is they didn't really answer your question fully, so you kind of give another question related to what you really wanted to know. And then of it, you should be clearly professional through the whole process and thank them for being involved. So I said that there's structured, unstructured, and semi-structured interviews. You can put in a quantitative survey itself, like an online survey or a printed survey, close-ended questions. But even in a face-to-face or online interview, you can actually use close-ended questions. Usually in a qualitative study, we're looking at unstructured interviews. People are coming to class so late. And it really depends on what you're hoping to get from the project as to what is most suitable. I tend to have a leading to people doing semi-structured interviews, because you have a frame, and then when people answer, you add additional questions. Unstructured interviews really are ones where you basically only have themes, and it's pretty much very open-ended. So with the documents, sometimes appropriate with permission to get records, either public or private. Clearly private, you need permission that is pertinent to your research questions, and so that you can mine that data. And if possible, you want to scan it so that you can just maybe hopefully have to not retype the text. With audiovisual material, if that's appropriate to your project, I really don't know of any recent major project that has used audiovisual material. Sometimes I can think of some with the documents. So I'm not sure how, so right now we're just talking about general all research projects. There can be appropriate situations where AV material is important. That's only if it addresses directly your research question. So you want to basically get permission again. You want to check out if this is both authentic and accurate, and then organize it in order to see what you can learn from that data. So with all data that you record, you want to follow basic protocols. So you're always going to create a form. In a large research project, everybody should be following the same form that tells you what are the instructions to say, the questions to be asked, the probes, and there's normally a literal, whether it's something on a tablet or something on a piece of paper where you're actually filling out the answers to the questions. Remember, in the best interview, you're also going to be recording it in case the person taking notes like misses something that's important. And in observation, clearly it's going to be even more important, because usually in observations, taking videos don't work really well, because even in a participant observation, the nature of things change too much by recording. So the only time you tend to have recording or observation is like things like HCI, human computer interaction, where like somebody wanting to see if the user interface works well for a new software program. Like large software development companies make up big labs, and then they have these one-way mirrors and record how people use the software and record it. And you say those are paid research subjects who know that what they're doing is being recorded. So both everything like a keystroke, and they know that they're recording to see how can we improve this kind of thing. have some things like that. Typically, people are not being videoed for observations. Usually it's just literally just take notes of what's happening in the field. So with the interview, you're going to want to have some kind of open-ended questions like an icebreaker to kind of get people used to you, and say, what is the point of this research project? Tell them what are the major research questions, allow them to, clarify, and then you're going to ask each question, have some notes, and upset the end time. For the observation, you're going to record stuff about the time, place, setting, etc. And then there's going to be 2 columns on the sheet. The left column to record what you've been seeing, and then at the right column you're going to record what you think about what you've been seeing. And then you'd also draw a sketch of the site. And then for data collection, you have some field issues, meaning when you're actually there on the setting, things can be challenging or even go really well. So one of the challenges is having a long enough time to collect data, and people being willing to be observed for long enough. I can even remember myself, I was on a particular project where I was asked to be in it. And this was actually a quantitative project, not qualitative. And the time it took for them to collect the data, I even asked them, could I just fill out the survey? But it was a printed survey. They said no. They had to ask me the questions. And I tell them I have degrees, I think I can. They said no, it's against the rules. So they sat down there, asked me the questions. But I knew for sure it would take me longer just to read the questions and fill out the form, but that was against their rule. But the point is, depending on what it is, it can take really long to collect whatever data, including observations or interviews, can be time consuming. And so she's going to build rapport with the participants. And as I said earlier, obviously you need to obtain permission no matter what for both documents and audiovisual material. So there are a long list of ethical issues. You need to tell the participants, not only tell them the purpose, they should understand the purpose of the project. That's why I was just laughing earlier for those who came late. At 2 minutes before this class, my colleague, I'm at the main campus of UTech right now. My colleague is telling me he needs to know my height. I actually have no problem telling the guy my height, but I'm like, after class right now, I'm not really talking. He needs to know it right now. It's research. I don't know what curiosity he wants on my height. I tell him after my 2 class, I have 2 class. I don't have no time for this conversation right now. Because the point is, even if it was actually real research, they should have told me the purpose of the research. There was no such disclosure, and so I ran them. I don't need no either talk. I know the 2 of them are going to laugh after me. I have no idea what they wanted for. I will tell them later if I feel like it. But the point is, serious again, whatever the project is. So let's say, like something I just read, there is a lot of concern about cyberbullying. I think in the past when I was teaching ethics, and I give a lecture on cyberbullying, I have heard more than one young man say, "Oh man, Jamaicans, that don't affect them." Maybe the people are talking about themselves, so maybe it don't affect them. I don't know the people who are talking, but to make a generalization that there's no one Jamaican in the whole country that can be affected by cyberbullying is a bit, at best, naive. But the point is, let's say we're going to the high schools, not like let's say, because I have some interest in that. Let's say I want to do a research project on cyberbullying in high schools. We'll get ethics approval. But the point is, we have to become clean with everything. We'd have to get what is called both consent and assent. So consent would be from parents and guardians of these children we're going to interview, because even teenagers, they're children, they're minors. And they would also need what is called assent. Assent is people who are hello, under the age of consent. Yes. Right. So you would need assent, as in basically permission from the teenagers, and then you need to collect this sensitive data. So the question is, there's this comment about refraining from deceptive practices. So usually most projects, you need to become clean what the project is really all about. However, there actually are some situations, not usually qualitative though, that with permission, their participants are not given the full story until afterwards. And we'll talk about that another day, not today. But in qualitative projects, it's usually just that people need to be told the truth before they're being interviewed or observed or in a focus group. That's I really have not heard. You'd have to have really have a massively good reason to not be fully informative as to why you're doing the research. So there are some reasons. If you go back to this where's the slide, you go to actually this whole idea of a non-participant observer. So the reason why they are non-participant observer is because when people look at observers, they change their behavior. So the reason why you do that is at the end of it, is still going to tell people, oh, we're doing research, and so it's still not there's no deception, but there's not full disclosure until the end. So there must be sharing of your soul either at the beginning or the end, because it's research is not supposed to be a private thing. You clearly need to be respectful of everybody and even the things at the research site. You must, as a principle, you must try to have the research benefit the place or the people where it was done. That's called reciprocity. Can't say the word properly, having a tongue-tied situation. In interviewing, you should be respectful and ethical. You should always maintain confidentiality. All the records should not be shared with anybody else. And the idea is that you're collaborating with the persons who are in the project, not the other way around. It's not that you're just doing things to them, you are with them working on a research project. Okay, so I said that I was going to spend a short time on this, time is passing. So if you remember, for those who were here last time, that we talked briefly about the difference between the population, which is the group that is being looked at by the researcher, and the sample, which is a subset. And then we said that there are different types of sampling, probability and non-probability, probability being the approach that leads to an equal chance of everybody in the population being sampled, and non-probability meaning there's not an equal chance. And we said that there are different types. So let's just go through them quickly. So can anybody remind me, because I said it last time, I explained what was simple random sampling. What is it again? Well, simple random stuff. You guys don't spend any time looking at the slides or reading textbooks between classes. It don't seem that way. Anyway, so simple random sampling is precisely that every member of the sample is chosen at random. So remember we said last time, we gave examples, that if you're thinking about the Jamaican population, at the moment, the only two lists that we could come up with is from Statin, or which is the organization that collects the census, for those who don't know, or the Jamaica voters list. But since Statin is not the census is not a public data set, but the Jamaican voters list is a public data set, we could take, if we wanted to figure out something about Jamaican adults and generalize, we could go on the Jamaican, I mean, it's not all of the population, but it is a lot of the population. So we could decide that we want 10% of the population, and we go from the voters list and use a random number generation and get it, or we could put all of those in some kind of box and literally select out of that box. That's simple random sampling. Maybe I should go to slide, current slide. All right, so systematic sampling is similar, but you just put the population, as in you can only do probability sampling when you have a literal list of all the persons in the population, or most of the persons in the population. And so you have that list, and then you say, okay, let's say back to my story where I want a fifth of the population. That would mean that every, make it easier, 1/10. If I start at number 4, so we order, I don't know, Jamaica's what? Let's just call it 3 million to make it really easy. So 1/10 of 3 million is how much? think it's 300,000. And let's say we start at item number 4 in the list of our, just make it easy, 3 million. What's the next one that we would select? So we selected number 4 on the list. What's the next person we select? Number 14, number 24, number 34, number 44. And you go all the way down until you select all the 300,000 people that you wanted. Yes. And that will give us our 300,000 out of the 3 million. Sorry, I could have gone to like maybe 3.8 million, whatever that number is, I don't know. But it's a pretty basic concept. So if you're thinking about UTech, I'm not sure what the right number is right now. Maybe it's about 11,000 students. It's been higher, but let's say it's 11,000 now. I don't know what the right exact number is. And if you wanted, again, a population sample that was maybe 200 students, would do something like this. You figure out a particular number, and then every nth number, this is relative to the percentage that you want. It's a rather simple idea. Here's a little bit more complicated now, the stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is where you want to look at subgroups. So since I went with UTech, let's make it very simple for us, males and females. So males and females are simple. So if you think of engineering at UTech have a whole lot more males than females, maybe about 9-to-1 among the student population, and for the staff, maybe it is, it's actually quite different. Maybe it's about 6-4 or 7-3. So there are more lecturers who are male, but there are a higher percentage of female academic staff. But there's much more. And so if we wanted, let's say there are 500 engineering students at UTech, and we wanted to do stratified sampling of the females, and there were exactly 1 in 10 female students, and we wanted to do a survey of 100 students. How many female students would we need to survey of that 100? Or how many men? This is a really easy question. This is like first one maths, or is it GSAC maths? This is really basic, guys. Come on. 100 engineering students, 90% are male and 10% are female, and we want to survey 100 students. How many would be male and how many would be female?
10 girls,
girls
10
and
females and 90 males.
Right, exactly. Right. That's all the strata thing is. It's an equal allocation based on the proportion. So if you go back to UTech now, the faculties, the College of Business and Management is the largest faculty. It's about 50%. And then our faculty, the Faculty of Engineering and Computing, is the second one, which maybe has about 30%, or maybe 25%, I don't know the exact number. So if you wanted us to be proportional, like, let's put everybody else in any other group. Let's say COBAM, that's the abbreviation, is 50%. Engineering and computing is maybe about 25%, and everybody else is maybe 30 for FENC. Sorry, FENC is Faculty of Engineering and Computing, and everybody is about 20. We might want to make it complicated. So let's make it really simple. We're doing again the same. Let's go to 200. It would be 50% of the 200 needs to be from COBAM, and 30% of the 200 needs to be from FENC, and 20% from the rest of the UTech population. That's it. Very simple. Anybody don't understand this? Not a complicated concept. And then cluster sampling is where you are going to randomly sample the people based on clusters. So you could look at, you want to know how vaccine hesitancy varies across a part of Jamaica, or maybe the computer literacy if you don't like the vaccine hesitancy. So we want to know computer literacy across the island, and we know it's different in case you all don't know. So what is it in St. Thomas versus Kingston versus Montego Bay versus, let's say, Westmoreland? So I just chose 2 rural parishes and 2 urban parishes, and then we could go ahead and then decide how we know, like, select among those clusters representations. So I chose 4 clusters, 2 rural, 2 urban parishes, and then we know within those clusters need to figure out how we can actually get people that are randomly selected among those clusters, as opposed to just taking the whole country. You can see how that will make be a less expensive project. So I wanted to represent both rural and urban areas, but I didn't want to do that from the entire country. And then there are a number of non-probability sampling techniques. So purposive, convenient, snowballing, quota. And if you remember in the qualitative project presentation just a while ago, we actually talked about purposive and snowballing quickly. So if you don't remember, snowballing sampling is where basically you have a difficulty finding people who match the criteria, and then you ask people who are in the sample, who else do you know? Purposive sampling is where you think really hard as to which people are best to ask. So you can read the slide later, or we'll come back another time. Last week we talked about convenient sampling. Convenient sampling is a situation where it's just first come whoever is willing to do it, but that don't mean it is representative of your group. So a lot of projects that people do in UTech is just convenience, but then you need to say that there's a serious methodological limitation, that you can only make comments about the sample. You cannot generalize the population because you did convenience sampling. So if you want to know about how UTech students feel about learning during the COVID-19 pandemic, and you just went on WhatsApp and found the first 100 people, even the first 50, even 1,500, no, not 1,500. If you found the first even 150 students, that is not necessarily representative of UTech. Why? Because what about all those people who can't bother to answer your question, and the ones who don't have are not part of your friend group, and so not seeing anything? A convenience sample is not necessarily representative. And then the thing that is the hardest, which I think we should wait till next week, so I wanted to read before we come back next week, is what is quota sampling. It's kind of intriguing. So quota sampling, it's just like the strata sampling we just talked about, but it is using convenience sampling. But I think, given that I have another class right now, I think I should ask you to read about